we're moving away from that sense of being tough-minded and, just pushing through as being what we mean by resilience at work, because of course that's a dangerous thing, really, pushing through.
Hi, welcome to the Conversations with Julie podcast. I'm your host, Julie Gillespie. Today, I've got a conversation about resilience. Now, I don't know about you, but I know that this word and I used to have a really bad relationship because it was this idea of you either had it or didn't. It was binary. And if I wasn't resilient, I must be broken. I've come to understand, though, that it's something completely different. And the person that was able to change that view is our guest today. Her name is Kathryn McEwen. She has done a lot of consulting work and coaching work over the years and was getting asked often about this idea of what is resilience. And the framework that she's been able to develop to be able to bring this to life so it was understandable and it was a concept that was attainable, no longer binary, but multifaceted, changed my view completely over what is resilience. So I want to take you through just quickly her bio because she's an incredible woman, and I'm going to read this because I don't want to miss anything in it. So Kathryn McEwen spends much of her working day helping co-create resilient cultures. She leads Working with Resilience, an international consortium of practitioners and researchers who use her measures, resources, and books. Recently, she became the co-founder of the world's first team resilience app, the Raw Team Solutions, which uses tech to enhance and scale the work she currently leads. So in our show notes, we're going to have information about what is resilience, and I've got in there Kathryn McEwen's white paper to really unpack all of this concept around it. Because resilience is the heart of our success at work. We need to manage our daily challenges in a healthy way. We also need to adapt to change and position ourselves for future challenges. So there's this idea of we bring who we are into what we do each day in a way that supports us to do better and to be at our best. So welcome to this conversation with Kathryn. I know for me, it's one that created a huge amount of difference. I look forward to hearing your response. So, Kathryn McEwen from Resilience at Work. I've loved the work that you've done so much because your understanding, your definition of resilience saved my idea on it. And I think I said to you when I first met you that I had this really awful relationship with the word resilience before I met you and before I came to your work. And so I just kind of want to thank you, first of all, for saving resilience in my world. And just kind of, and I just want to ask you a couple of questions to get everyone, understanding what it is that you do. So why did you go into work around resilience? What got you started doing that?
Yeah, good question, Julie. It came from requests from clients, as it often does. So it's quite a while ago now, probably about 15 years ago, in my consulting work, people started asking for resilience. And this was quite a new thing back then and reflective of some trends that we've certainly seen playing through in recent years. But it was really, so they were asking for it. So, like a good consultant, I was thinking, well, what does it look like to deliver on that request?
Yeah. So when you started doing the research into resilience, was there a lot of work already a lot of studies done in resilience, or?
No, it was really a new area in the workplace. I mean, resilience as a concept has been around a long time. And I think some of the original work came from children of schizophrenic mothers in Hawaii, so there was an interest in terms of the trauma area and how people had moved through really difficult events. But in the workplace, surprisingly, given it's almost sort of one of the most popular words at the moment at work, I think, at that stage, really, it wasn't a word that was used. People have been talking a lot about stress and pressure for many years, occupational stress. There was a whole research piece around that. but resilience and what it actually meant, and more importantly, in a consulting world, what do you need to do to build it to support your managers and leaders? That was really unknown territory back then, actually, which is surprising.
Yeah, because when we have a look at the conversations around resilience now, there's a lot of still misunderstanding of what it actually means and how people can apply it. And it comes up. So I just want to share with everyone your definition of individual resilience, because I know there's a few different definitions, but just that individual resilience, what's that about?
Yeah, so I basically based my definition on the problems people were trying to solve when they asked me for this concept of resilience, because there's about 140 definitions in the literature, and you can read all these reviews around what it is. But for me, it's okay. If they're asking for it, what is it, the problems they're trying to solve? So for me, a person is individually resilient if they are on top of their everyday pressures and managing them in a healthy way. They're adapting to the things that are happening around them. And of course, that's been really huge recently. But they also have an eye to the horizon around proactively positioning. So for me, it's not about bouncing back. It's not about tough-mindedness, because that was never really what people were asking for. They were asking for ways to do more with less, manage change and uncertainty, deal with difficult clients, manage complexity, So my definition was always framed around the problems people were trying to solve. So you'll see certainly, lots of different versions of that. And I think some of the reasons why we might be getting some pushback, as you said, you've got a healthier relationship with the word yourself. I think that, we're moving away from that sense of being tough-minded and, just pushing through as being what we mean by resilience at work, because, of course, that's a dangerous thing, really, pushing through.
Oh, absolutely. And, my idea of resilience, before I came to you it was binary. You either were resilient and tough or you weren't and broken. And, so I spent a long time being broken because I wasn't feeling resilient and because, things were tough. But this idea of being able to manage it, being able to adapt and kind of move with it, move despite the struggle and the stress, but being able to employ different things to be able to be okay with how you're feeling.
Yeah, and that's a really important point, isn't it? That you felt not resilient, whereas it's not actually a fixed thing,
No.
At all. But and that's a very negative space to be in, isn't it? When you feel you're not resilient, and it's binary, as you said.
Yeah, so this individual resilience, like there's, a number of components to that. And, we're going to put the white paper of yours with our show notes and everything so people can access it. But just the 7 components, like when there's more than one thing, when there's more than 2 things, when there's this multiple of factors that we can draw upon to be in flow with resilience and kind of move with resilience. I love that idea that there's this, if something's not working, but there are other bits that are, there's that hope factor.
Absolutely, yeah. And the model that we use is framed very positively as a strengths focus. So it's not like a deficit of I'm not good enough and I haven't got this. It's if I want to have a better set of routines and skills that enable me to manage what comes at me, what might they look like for me in my context, in my job, in my life?
Because I think that's where the conversation starts, right? When we've got this binary thing, how do you speak into that? I'm not feeling resilient. Oh, well, that's tough. What do you want to do about it? I don't know. Whereas if someone's saying, I'm just having a really tough time and I'm just not finding my groove, well, how's this aspect going? Like, I know like living in purpose, living authentically, physical health, your network, all of these aspects are in that. And so this is why I want to talk about it on this podcast of conversations, because that's where the conversation goes, doesn't it? Like, how are you feeling in this particular area?
Yes. And I think it's really important to understand where people are before you can actually open that conversation. So for us in our work, as you know, because you're part of our global community, Julie, it's actually around, well, where are you at the moment? And here's a framework of things that you might consider that might be going well or might not be going so well. that really then inform an action, and the action might be something to do or actually might be a shift in thinking. But it's a very positive, I wouldn't say a roadmap, but a framework for you to make sense, I guess, of where you are. But importantly, as you said, Julie, to provide a pathway and not feel I'm stuck in this, I'm not resilient and I'm not good enough.
Yeah. So, this is a measure, and I love that because I've done a lot of the profiling over the years to make sense of where I'm at. But this was the one and probably the only one that I've done that's given me this clear indication of what I can do to thrive. And despite, because I do have mental illness, that's just been part of my framework for a very long time. But this idea of still being able to action things to work towards a better outcome, a better life, really, was amazing. So it's great to have that measure and then indicators of what can be done in those spaces. And that's why I love the framework.
And I just want to pick up on the mental illness thing that you mentioned there too, Julie, because I strongly believe that people who've had a tough time, who've gone through trauma and mental illness periods, they have an enormous amount to draw on. They already know a lot of those skills and abilities and ways of thinking. And sometimes it's about deploying those to a different scenario. So I've had lots of people I've coached who said to me, well, I've been through periods of depression before. And, so the first thing I'm interested in is what did you learn about yourself and what did you do to get out of that you can now bring to this scenario? Because I think we often don't see those connections. A bit like teachers, I work a lot with educators and they seem to have these skills in terms of working with the students, but they don't necessarily apply them to themselves and to their colleagues sometimes. So that transferability is a really important thing.
So when we're in a conversation with someone who's having a tough time, asking about what they've done to alleviate that before, is this reminder of what they can do?
Absolutely. So what did you do last time that worked that you could bring to this situation is a fairly common approach to coaching, isn't it? Where we're trying to look at what strengths people have and how they might bring them and how they might nuance them in a different scenario. Is a really great way of leveraging the troubled times. Some of the research in resilience is that the more difficult times you have that you move through, the more the growth, it's that traumatic growth aspect, so some people have some traumatic times and they get stuck, but those who move through it have a great repository of strategies and ways of being and doing that just enable them to take on more and more and more. I was having a conversation just last week in a workshop of a woman who was that, she's a businesswoman, and we're talking about her resilience as a businesswoman and, what she's gone through in the last 2 years. And she related it all to being a carer. She has a child with a disability, and she's, it's sort of, she was able to quite easily translate those skills in terms of being a parent and what she had to do to her business. So she was doing a beautiful job, I thought, of making that correlation. Yeah,
I think this is such an important point in how we frame things, isn't it? And this is why I love the framework, the Resilience at Work framework, because it gives us that frame to be able to shift and see those resources that we've got, that we've been building for years through our experiences, and being able to apply them constructively in something.
Yes, for sure.
I want to take this into the conversation, then taking it from the individual into teams. Because yes, there are the conversations that we have as individuals, but what about then when it comes to the team aspect? What does a resilient team even look like?
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting area that I think is still underexplored. So we've had pretty much a plethora over the last couple of years, and even before that, of what creates well-being and resilience at work, and it tends to be almost not all, but predominantly focused on me individually. So if we were to apply our raw individual model that we've just been talking about, Julie, you've got a lot of work on, but you are investing in your energy, your diet, exercise, and sleep. You are practicing, perspective and gratitude. You're linking into your support systems. You're making sure you're open to feedback. You're really aligned with the purpose and the values. So you're doing all of those things. that look after your backyard, if you like. So you're accountable. But what we know is that doesn't necessarily create a team which is collectively managing the pressures and adapting, because it's all about the alignment. And in fact, when we developed our raw team model, I was really interested in what is it that teams who are managing to adapt and thrive and better manage in the same system, what are they doing that's different? They've got the same problems that they're experiencing in the workplace, but they're doing something different. And it is very much that collective understanding and alignment. And we can explore some of those areas of that.
Oh, absolutely. Because the conversations start in those aspects, don't they? So this idea of this collective well-being, this collective purpose and alignment. Because they're not, so many groups that I go into and organizations I go into, they don't have this collective purpose where there's this, not necessarily agreement to the finite point, but there's an alignment in thinking. Because that can be quite different things. That, having something that sits side by side cohesively is different than having to agree specifically on something, right?
Definitely, yeah, that's right. And so what we'll find is that if we don't have that collective agreement, then we actually have conflict. So our raw team model is almost the opposite of what every conflict you can have in a team. So it's a strengths focus on potential problems. So just as an example, you mentioned purpose. So, I might be really clear. I might be a volunteer and I might be really clear on what it is I believe I'm there to do. But someone else starts and they've got a very different view of what that is, or a different view of the goals or the values, so straight away, even though I'm clear on mine, and that's really useful for my resilience, it actually creates an immediate conflict. Well, they're here for the wrong reasons, or they're not doing things, how they're not doing the way we do it around here, so, and people can get very lofty around those principles of, of how we do and what we are and what we stand for. So they become an immediate part of conflict. And in our model, that's covered off by what we call the robust components. So there's 7 components again, that are really important to get alignment on. And certainly if you haven't got alignment on purpose and values, you're immediately in major strife, aren't you? Because people are coming to the table with different versions of why they're there and what they're there to do.
Absolutely. And so because I want to sit in like the conversational aspect of this, when we've got a team that is going through these changes, where they've had new people come in, where they're starting to feel less resilient or less aligned and, not able to perform optimally, where does the conversation start to be able to get that process going?
I think it starts with a regrouping on the shared expectations. And that's largely what this model is all about. It's about the 7 aspects that are really important for us to be a team that manages its pressures healthily, adapts and is proactive. The same definition that we used before, only with a collective headset. So it starts with that conversation. So every time we change membership of the team, our role might change. New team is formed. It's really important to have these basic conversations to be really clear on why are we here, what are we doing, what are our values, what are our goals, what does belonging look like here, what does support look like here, what does being resourceful look like here. So the model enables people to have a very constructive, strengths-based conversation around how do we be the best we can be in this system. And, might not be thriving, but it just might be the best we can be in the system. So the conversation absolutely starts with expectations of each other. And the model provides a framework to open up the conversations. And in fact, a lot of the work that we've been doing is to actually work on what those questions are. So, so providing those open-ended coaching, reflective questions that exactly do what you're saying. They get the conversation started around what does belonging look like?
I know,
what
right?
does support look like?
Well, because I have questions that I speak to my groups about, doing the mental health first aid training about what does safety look like? What does not being in judgment look like? What does trust look like? And people genuinely don't often know the answer for themselves. So to be able to have these guided questions in and around a really robust framework that informs people and keeps people in strengths focused instead of blamey focus is a beautiful way. I love that.
You've got to get to a quite granular level, haven't you? So when you're saying what does safety look like, it's very, very much around what it looks like in their environment for them in the role they do. So the great thing about having a framework is you can go to that granular level and people immediately get it. So what does safety look like? When it actually means I'm able to say what I need to say without feeling judged. It means that there's a forum where I can come to that and know that that's actually a forum where it's okay to raise that. So, and they'll make that very, very specific. It's almost like I don't know how many millions of team charters I've done over my career, but you take the values, don't you, and you translate them into what it looks like in your team. Well, what we're doing with the resilience framework is we're taking values, but we're also taking heaps of other elements that we actually know create effectiveness in challenge and change and uncertainty. And there's a lot of things involved in the team. So I also like to think about strategically at the moment, what's our major pain point and challenge for the team, and which are the elements of this model that we might need to leverage our strengths on and address our needs on, because to try to be good at everything is really, really tricky, I think. So it's about where do we start in the conversation as well. So it's opening up, but I think it's also a focused starting point as well that's really important in this work.
Because I know from the work that I've been doing over the years that to get to this point for myself, it's been practice. And it's been a regular practice with frameworks, with understanding, with co-designed stuff going on with people around me. So there's this thoughtful, intentional way of being able to get better at what I do. I don't necessarily know what it's going to be like at the end because you don't know what you don't know, right? But being able to start somewhere and then practice and then see that next phase and being able to then morph into that and grow, I think is this beautiful idea. And it slows the pace down.
Well, I think practice in a team scenario is about creating the space, isn't it? Because we're all too busy, no time.
We wear it like a badge.
But it's actually about making it part of your practice as a team, which means creating space and often a structure for that, So, and this is why we've developed our new Teams app and platform, is because it's actually a structure that gets people to periodically focus on these elements that create team resilience. So, so where's the space? What's the structure? And being clear on the intent, that's what practice looks like at a team level, I think.
Because when we were first talking about doing this podcast together, we're going through a few ideas and we started off in the individual, but we came into this idea about the collective. One of the one of the quotes I love is from Drs. Nagoski on their burnout book, is the cure for burnout isn't self-care, it's caring for each other.
Yes.
And it just sits and supports this so well, because I know that even when I'm having a really tough time, when I turn up in a collective, when I turn up in a group, things change and I feel like, I can let the other stuff go and I can just enjoy this movement and feeling good within being part of something and being productive and fruitful. When we're talking about that, we talked about mutual care and mutual support and accountability. Really important words when we're talking about a collective, isn't it?
Yes. And I think they're at the heart, aren't they?
They are so much. And I really wanted to, spend some time sitting in this, because what does mutual care even look like?
Yes, I sort of use the analogy when we talk about mutual care and accountability in a team with parenting, So, good parenting is that right balance, isn't it, between I'm here to support and help you with being really clear on expectations. So if we have too many expectations without the support, people fail. If we support too much without the expectations, they don't necessarily grow. So if we translate that to a team, again, it's about having the conversation, isn't it, around, well, firstly, what does support look like? You know, is
Because
it
that's
about
different for
being
each person, isn't it?
Yeah. And it's about, so in a team, you know, sharing what that might mean. So it might be, I might say support for me is being able to debrief, you know, when something's gone wrong and you giving me 5 minutes just to sit in that listening. Or support for me is you know, letting me just go for a walk, or support might be leaving me in my own space. So having a conversation around what self-care and support looks like is really interesting. So, you know, you're talking about how do you recognize when I need support, how I want to be approached when it looks like I need support. Very individualistic, but having those conversations really inform then how we work together on that, and it needs to be very tangible. You know, we all look after each other here. We're all supportive. And the other thing I want to mention about support is we also need to be thinking about support across teams, because I've seen quite a lot of teams who are supportive within their team, but not across teams. So support with other teams as well as within our team as well, I think is really important. So that's the support piece. Yeah, you're right, individualistic, but those conversations.
Then
And
that
then
balance
accountability.
yeah, I know, right?
Yeah.
This is where, like, as parents, we just go, oh, God, I got to discipline. But it's not about discipline, is it? So accountability is one of those words, once again, that gets really tossed about but not understood. So in your reference here and frame of work here, accountability is?
Yes, so accountability is being really clear on the expectations of me and of us, and being responsible for holding that expectation. So those expectations can be around a huge amount of things. There's the obvious one around workload, but there's also around how I show up, my mood. There's also about how I, boundaries around clients, for example. I mean, I know in not-for-profit that different professional boundaries can create huge tensions and issues in terms of service delivery. So again, the framework provides a little bit of some discussions around what are the expectations we have in these spaces of how we behave and think and act. And also the next piece of that, of course, is expectations of if I'm not meeting those, making it okay for you to tell me that, So again, it goes back to the team charter days of, this is what I've agreed, but, if I'm not meeting this, it's okay for you to tell me that. And the other thing I might mention is that balance of support and accountability, of course, shifts, So I think when we're under enormous pressure, then we can sort of up the ante a little bit on expectations and being quite tasky. But we can only do that if we've invested in the support. And we've had a lot of scenarios in recent years where you've had to be quite tasky. And if you haven't invested in the support, then people feel non-cared about and, discounted. So they're not going to step up. Similarly, the other, and I know we had a little bit of chat about this previously, Julie, is support. If you provide too much support and it impacts on the rest of the team, then that can be problematic. And the classic one would be someone who's got, major problems at home, perhaps mental illness. We need to support those people, but we also need to recognize the accountability of them to the team. And people very quickly in a team get resentful if they feel the support is for someone else and not equitable. So there's
favoritism
so
and
many
stuff like
elements to this support and accountability piece, I think.
Hey, it's Julie here. I thought we'd just take a quick break. I just wanted to say thank you for listening, and I'm glad you're here with us. It would mean the world to me if you could support this podcast by leaving a review, following it, or sharing it with someone you want to start a conversation with. Now, back to the conversation. Yep, because I can tell you, coming from, a history of mental illness, for me, to be favoured and to have that support directed in without the accountability, it does nothing to help.
Yes. And it makes it really difficult for you, doesn't it, to fit, you feel even more undeserving when you know your colleagues are stepping up for you, more and more and more. It plays into the I'm not good enough.
Absolutely. And I really want to be clear on this, is that to be able to have a plan, a care and support plan, but also an accountability plan of let's keep clear on our expectations as we go. Let's keep clear on the accountability as we go. If things shift for you for any particular reason, let's talk about it then and there as it's happening so we can, support you through it, but also to make sure how we need to shift that and the adjustments that need to be made so you can turn up the next day.
Yeah, and I wonder whether there's enough of that reviewing that happens, so someone might have a diagnosis of anxiety, so you set something up. I don't think there's enough review that happens. And perhaps there's a review with a medical review, for example, but that review has to be around the context, because it might be in that time that you've been having modified duties that they've lost a staff member. So the whole team dynamic is shifting, so you need to be, that accountability is about what's going on in the broader environment and how do we best manage this, because it is a job after all. So we want to support you, but we also need to recognize that there's work to deliver. And if we're not accountable to the team as well and where they're sitting, then it's a road to nowhere, isn't it?
Because I think everyone wants that, what is expected of me. Let's be really clear on it. And I don't think it matters whether someone's got a mental illness, mental health problem, having a tough day, or is just sitting in their flow every day. There still has to be these guides and these boundaries and this roadmap of what things are to look like.
And of course, we've moved well, into the personal home situation in recent years, where, the majority of the situations I've seen that have been problematic have not actually been around mental illness at all. They've actually been around people's home lives and what's going on there and trying to manage that. Domestic violence, for example. How do you manage living in domestic violence when you're working from home? So and if you're a manager and you're aware of that, that's a really tricky thing to navigate. And your colleagues might be aware of that as well, and they want you to be safe. But how is that best managed? So I think the home situation has become a much larger factor that needs consideration and support than it has in the past, because quite often that was hidden. People didn't necessarily
absolutely
know what was going on when you left the work.
So a lot of this stuff, and this is why I wanted people to hear this breakdown of resilience, the individual but also the team. It just seems like there's ongoing practice of conversations where people are being clear about where they're currently at. Now, we're not talking about how they're feeling in their personal lives and all of the detail. It's about the conversations that have already been set and agreed upon around purpose and alignment and values, and things like that, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. And one of my favorite expressions is, resilience is a journey, not a destination. So on any journey, we're checking in on how far we've come. Have we had a major setback? Has there been a roadblock and we couldn't get through, down that country road, whatever it is. And so the check-in, I think, has become very much more part of organizational life, whether it's the beginning of the meetings or whether it's a leader check-in or whatever it might look like. Where are you at the moment? Because of the variability and the uncertainty, I think that checking in has become more and more, and checking out, in meetings, checking in, checking out, those sorts of things. I'm seeing those become far more part of work practices than they've been in the past. And of course, this is one of the reasons we've been speaking about.
Well, in that, and I'm glad you brought that up, because I have a lot of managers that are going, starting to do this more and more and are starting to play with it, which is great. But for those who are coming in and saying, well, a check-in, am I asking how people feel and have to get into that? Or what does a check-in look like when we're supporting a resilient team? Like, what are some of the things that you've seen that work really well?
Yeah, so we have these coaching cards, and we use images as one example. Which image reflects who, where you are at the moment. One number, one animal, one. There are lots of creative ways you can do the check-in versus how are you today. And I mean, I'm reminded when you say how are you of the dementias in the group, who'll tell you the whole medical history if you say how are you, and the meaning sort of sabotage. So you have to be quite creative around the way you actually do it, rather than have that open-ended expecting everyone to share everything. I do feel, though, that if you do it routinely and you do it with a little bit of variety, people are more likely to be honest rather than say, I'm fantastic. So it becomes, again, the practice of it, doesn't it? The deep practice that actually enables it to be real, rather than something that's actually meaningless or something that totally sabotages a meeting with people sharing how awful life is.
Yeah, because
it's counterproductive too.
It is, because it's catching.
Yeah, it's the emotional contagion thing, isn't it? Where we go in and we feel okay, but by the time we've left, we feel pretty awful.
Oh God, I've got to work with these people. Because I've seen places where they have a barometer and it's just this number, and it's like, well, it's so contextual. Like, how can we say that your 6 is the same as my 6? It doesn't have that. But you brought up variety and using cards as a descriptor, because people don't have the language around this, around emotions, around how they're actually feeling, because there are so many layers. Like, we can feel 6 different things at once. We don't have a singular emotion at any one time. So to ask how someone's feeling and use a single word just doesn't make sense. So having a bit of variety, having cards to describe. What we're also doing is helping people and training people to create the language.
Yes. And imagery is brilliant for that. I mean, I quite often use the cards with the images to say, okay, which one speaks to you about resilience today? What's your version of resilience today? Which one is your mood today? So, and people will give you quite a quick, deeper dive, and it can be really creative in terms of what they see there. So imagery is one way, but it's not, there's lots of different ways of doing that.
I think that's great, because, people are needing to practice to have conversations again. I've the amount of people that have said, oh, conversations, and what's in a conversation? That sounds great. What is it all about? Instead of going, oh, a conversation, I know how to have a conversation. I don't get that side of it. So to be able to kit people up and resource people up with this idea of being able to practice and play and have a few different ways of being able to get into it helps to have...
and I think the more you have conversations around the positive everyday things, the more the pathway into the difficult conversations. So if we're not having a conversation on how are you, then how on earth are we going to have a conversation with, well, I'm feeling you're not meeting, our agreement around accountability here. I mean, it's really a big jump to go from A to Z. So talking about the things that matter in a team and the things that are challenging for us as a team is just, like, to me, the entrance step to the really difficult conversations.
I'm so glad you've said that, because I've not been able to articulate that. So thank you. You've now got it out there, and it's now articulated so beautifully of these are the pathways, these are the entry things where we get to practice. So when it does come time for hey, I need you to, have a conversation with you about our expectations and the boundaries that we've set, and I just want to go through a few things with you, there's trust and there's safety in being able to do that, and it becomes a much easier conversation instead of something hard, difficult, or, something that you try to avoid.
And I think it's a skill. It's like getting on a bike, isn't it? Having difficult conversations. So I must say, I mean, I don't like having difficult conversations, but I do that. That's my job, So, I don't know how many situations I've been in where I've had to give feedback no one else has been willing to give someone on a team, and you just learn to do it in the best way you can. You use a lot of sense focus, you contextualize it, and so on. It becomes a skill, and I must say I don't like it, but I've certainly realized it's really important, and you get good at doing it. So And I also facilitate a lot of conversations. So I do a lot of mediation. So you're sitting in, high emotion, high conflict scenarios. I work with dysfunctional teams. So you just have to suck it up and do it, and just it's a practice again. You get better at it, but avoiding it is. Well, it's really a road to nowhere, or you have to get someone like me to do it for you, which also is not very sustainable either.
But it also sends a message of, I can't do this with you for a particular reason. And that's exclusionary, and that kind of says to someone, you don't belong here. Like, it's counterintuitive, isn't it? And to be able to say, I don't know what I'm going to say. I don't know how this is going to come across, but I need to say these things. Can you help me to make this a conversation that's going to be easier for both of us?
Mm-hmm. And a lot of people will use the excuse of, I don't want to damage the relationship. So particularly groups of women who are in conflict, there's this sort of veil of, we all get on really well here, and, we're all friends. And then the minute you give them an opportunity, they'll tell you every imaginable, did you know she's been divorced 3 times? And you're thinking, what's that got to do with, they'll dig the daggers in. So there's sort of like this superficial teamwork, and so what we know is effective teams argue really well, it's constructive discontent, whatever you want to call it. And I'm reminded of when, you see interviews of people who've been married for a long time, so it might be their 60th anniversary, and the interviewer says, well, what's your secret to success? And they say, we've never argued. And you think, heavens, it must be the most boring relationship. And in teams, if you can't argue well, then really there's no way that you can be effective. So if you're pretending you're liking each other and you're friends, but underneath there's this bubbling discontent, how on earth are you effective? So getting the bubbling discontent into this conversation around frameworks, whatever they might be, around the things that we have to talk about, it just means the discontent is less bubbling. Still always be there a little bit, but, and women are really not as good as men at doing this, I have to say,
We're not as direct.
For women.
Is it because we're not as direct?
I think we like to be liked more. And I suppose we're also indoctrinated into it, and sort of the caring role and so on. But I've really found that women, particularly who've worked together a long time, who are work with high emotional labor, they tend to be more the ones where it all goes underneath. They feel they can't have those conversations because they don't see it as caring. They want to be liked, they want to be friends, but they don't recognize a good friendship means working through really difficult things.
So these conversations about resilience and team resilience can lead to de-escalating that and being able to tap into what's happening and being able to help find resolutions, maybe through different language and maybe through, different points, but it helps to settle those things and resolve.
Yeah, and I'm a big fan of differentiating source from symptoms, so in mediation, I'll get asked to mediate between 2 people, for example, who are not getting on, and, they'll say, I think it's a personality conflict or whatever. But when you actually start to talk to them, you find there's so many other things that sit underneath that, around histories, around structures, around job roles, So for me, it's really always important to look up what's the source of the discontent. And so if you're already having conversations around the things that are potential sources of discontent and conflict, then quite often you don't get to having to have the difficult conversations because you've actually resolved the issues. And in a workplace, that's even more. It's rarely the people bashing heads because they don't like each other. It's more the stuff that's happened, in terms of you got that job and I wanted that job, and, you're the manager's favorite and I'm not, and you're getting to do the good projects and I'm not. It's all the system stuff quite often that actually then translates into me having a skewed view of you and who you are, and, which leads to the conflict. So mediation is a really interesting area in terms of...
I think that's a whole other conversation for us, Kathryn.
Right, okay. I won't hijack this one.
Oh, no. Well, I mean, it's I wouldn't mind, but it goes for a very long podcast. So I do want to come back to that. But I love that we've kind of unpacked this individual resilience, but then, this team resilience, we can also translate to families a bit, can't we?
Yes. Oh gosh, family businesses. Wow.
I come from one.
Wow.
Hi, Mum.
Wow,
Hi, Dad.
Wow. My most memorable experience in difficult conversations. Have I got 2 minutes to tell you this?
Absolutely. Please.
Yes. So I ran a workshop on resilience. This a long time ago, and a woman, she was a nurse, she said, would you mind facilitating a conversation between my husband, my brother-in-law, and my father-in-law? And they're all in business together. I said, sure. So they arrived, and the father was quite elderly, and there were two man mountains arrive. And I've got quite a small consulting room. So the two man mountains are sitting on the couch next to each other, looking straight ahead. And then there's Dad in the other chair, totally distressed. And there's me, and a lot of stuff's gone down. And basically, the sons are not speaking to each other. The business is about to implode. Dad wants to retire. He's not well. And it's just not going anywhere. So I'm using my usual stuff. It's just not going anywhere. And I'm thinking, oh, holy Moses. So I called a break. And so they go out and have a cigarette, not talking to each other. And Dad is crying, it's really distressing. So I think, oh, what am I going to do now? So anyway, they come back in, man mountains on the couch, looking straight ahead, looking very annoyed, and I don't want to be here. And so so amazingly this worked. I said to them, okay, I said, I want you just to spend a couple of minutes just reflecting on and imagining in 10 years' time when Dad, imagine your dad's not here and Mum's gone. And I want you to think about how old your children are, what you might be doing. And I want you to think about the impact of not having resolved this today, your children not speaking to each other. So I painted this scene of basically being estranged from each other 10 years down the track, and their family being not talking to each other, and obviously the business being gone. And anyway, just totally shifted it. And they embraced, and everyone's crying, and, the mountains are crying, Dad's crying, Dad's relieved, So why am I telling this story? Well, family businesses, the whole emotional stuff, the sibling rivalry, the dad like you more and the whatever. But it just shows you that it's really risky, but it's never too late to have those conversations. It could have been too late for those people if they sort of kept on their journey of parallel universes, which is where they wanted to go. But yeah, so you that was prompted by the family business things, because once we have other relationships coming into a team, it's even more complicated and even more emotional and even more difficult, I think. So, yeah.
Well, because the staff in that business would be highly impacted by how they're all feeling about one another, and not being able to communicate, walking on eggshells all the time, really inefficient and unproductive.
Yeah, and that business would have ceased to have been, they probably would have sold it. They built it up as well, it would have been a bit of the family tradition and the legacy, and probably one of those that the children would have gone into as well, that sort of, yeah.
So sometimes, like when there's an impossible conversation that needs to be had, reaching out for help is a great idea. Because sometimes we're not necessarily going to be the person heard in that space, but being able to reach out to someone. I'm surprised they turned up. I'm just putting this out there. I think that's awesome that they actually turned up, because that in itself showed interest in wanting to find a resolution. They just didn't know what to do when they were there.
Yes, I think the wives had been a little bit good on them as well.
I'm sick of talking.
Because they were in the business as well. The wives were, one was a nurse, but they were all sort of, you can't, when you're in a family business, you can't totally alienate yourself from it, can you? Because your finances are all included in it. But you're right, yeah. It demands bravery, and it was brave for them. them to come. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that.
One of those really memorable. I mean, I've done a lot of mediations, but that to me is probably the most memorable one ever.
They turned up. I say to so many people, like, if you don't know what to do, turn up and see what happens. And, if you can turn up, that's sometimes the hardest part. Something's going to happen because you're there and you've got this intent of finding a solution. And I think that just paves the way and just makes things a little smoother to be able to, do stuff.
And the skill becomes, when do you push and when do you challenge and when do you pull back? It's a dance. And, when we are I'm not just talking about mediation here, I'm talking about difficult conversations. I do a lot of coaching with people who've been sent because they're problematic, so it's that right balance of, again, them being supportive but being accountable. So challenging and asking and requesting and reflecting back, but also recognizing you need to create a safe, supportive space. And it's a real dance, and it's difficult one-on-one, but if we're doing that within a team and we think about the number of relationships, so I think if there's 6 in a team, I think it's 6 by 5 divided by 2 relationships or something, if that's the right maths. There's a lot of dynamics. It starts to get more and more complicated to be able to stand up and say what you need to say in a group, far more difficult than one-on-one.
So a leadership skill, like a basic 101 leadership skill, is practicing mutual care, support, and accountability, and practicing the balance between those and the conversations that are needed to be able to do that effectively.
Yeah, and again, it can't be done other than in a conversation. It's about, I think leaders need to have facilitation skills. That's essentially, the skill that sits under these types of conversations is the capacity to facilitate discussion, to frame it, to make it bounded, to make sure everyone gets a voice, to make sure that it's kept on track. There's a whole skill set, which is probably the one I've had to develop over the years as my professional skill set, is to be able to hold that space and keep it moving in the right direction with everyone still on board, and no one sort of feeling alienated in that. Because the minute you get one person in the group alienated, you actually don't have a team. You've got a group with one outside of the group. So facilitating, I think I'll vote for that as a key leader skill.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. Well, what I'm going to do, I've got 3 questions that I like to ask all of my guests that come in, because it's me collecting data, and I'm always curious and have a bit of fun with the answers. So the first one is, fill in the blank. A conversation can
transform relationships, and so within a workplace, transform cultures.
Yes. Love that answer. Thank you so much. What has been the greatest lesson, good or bad, that you've learned about having conversations?
Oh, if I go back to the lovely family business I've just mentioned, that it's risky, but it's worth it. So there's high risk for them, as you said, showing up. High risk for dad, because they could have ended up punching each other, actually. We sort of got to that,
Yeah. Yeah. So it's high risk, but it's worth it.
Yeah.
What is something you would like others to know about having difficult conversations?
I'm convinced you can't possibly grow without difficult conversations. And if we translate that to the workplace, you can't actually develop without getting feedback, which means sometimes hearing things we don't necessarily want to hear. So in an environment where we have more change and uncertainty, and this is an element of resilience as well, we need to be able to get feedback to be able to adapt to that change. So if we're not taking that on board and we're not seeking that and responding to it, then we can't be resilient, and we certainly can't grow. So again, I think it's a very career limiting move if you are not open to people telling you things you don't want to hear.
Yeah. Oh, wow. Like, I love those answers. Thank you. That's, it just simplifies these things so much, doesn't it? Well, that's wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing space with me, Kathryn. I really appreciate your time and, with all of the work that you're doing from a global perspective, in working with teams and helping to build the resilience of teams, conversation at a time. It's just amazing work, and I really admire everything that you're doing. It's the true word, I think, that needs to be spread around resilience at work. So thank you.
Congratulations to you, Julie, on a great podcast. So I hope that it just continues to get more and more successful and more reach.
Thank you.
Because it is a very important topic that's at the hub of all of these things, isn't it, really? You've got to have the conversation around these things.
Yeah.
Whatever it might be, whether they be resilience, engagement, whatever they might be.
Yeah.
It starts with
wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to that conversation with Kathryn McEwen from Resilience at Work. There were so many points in that there was the sense of overwhelm of, gosh, what do we even have as takeaways? And I know in my first conversation with Kathryn, I was just left with this sense of, God, the heart of resilience is something completely different to what I always thought it was. And there's this idea of collective resilience, because the doctors Nagoski, when they wrote their book on burnout, they have this quote in there that the cure for burnout isn't self-care. It's all of us caring for each other. And so if we're wanting to do better, if we're wanting to feel better about where we're at, it's looking for that collective. And the heart of that collective resilience was this idea of mutual support and accountability. Now, to find the balance between those is really essential, because if we sit in just support and just care, it's not. We end up not setting really great boundaries. And there's also not this idea that that person can do it and should do it for themselves. But if there's too much accountability, that flip side of it, where it's just task focused, the human element gets left by the wayside. So that balance between mutual support, mutual care, and accountability, I think, is this great idea and concept that business leaders can actually tap into, because they can balance out their approach. Take the tasks, because we need to perform. We're there on contract. It's a reality. But if we can balance that out with mutual support, remember, mutual is two-way. There's more to it than just caring for someone. It's that mutual side to it, I think, is really important. And it changes our conversations that we have. Some of the things that we spoke about is that the practice of those conversations, the practice of that mutual care and support and accountability, when we practice those, that's what gives us space. And this idea of being able to, I guess, not sit in reaction so much, and being able to, be ready for feedback, be ready for the types of conversations that have to take place. To do that, Kathryn was talking about checking in and checking out in conversations. Being able to do a check-in that's effective. So effective being, how's someone feeling? Now, we don't necessarily need to go into feelings per se in the detail of it, because so often we don't even have the language around that that's safe to say in front of a professional group of people. So she was talking about some really incredible tools that we're going to put links in the show notes for these tools, but talking about a variety of things that we use to be able to do that check-in, whether it's imagery, whether it's cards, whether it's numbers, where it can be all sorts of different things that you might just pick up this picture and this is me today. This is what my resilience looks like today or feels like today. This is my mood of the moment. And what happens each time when we do that, it helps us to develop the language of how we're feeling in a way that's safe for that group, but also meaningful. Our context is built up over a period of time. So I really invite you to have a look at what you can do to bring life to this conversation. Share this conversation with your team. I think it's a great one to share. And, pick a point that, is a great takeaway for each of your team and have that conversation. And have a look at some of the tools that you can be introducing to help people explain how they're going. Thank you for being part of this conversation. It's an incredible one, and one that we really need at the moment. Talking about resilience, is essential as individuals, but as a team, as an organization, as a community, it's a very necessary one. Here's a conversation that I believe is going to make a huge difference. So I invite you to share this conversation with someone you want to start a conversation with. We love getting reviews. We love knowing what you thought of what we did and what we unpacked, and rate, review, and do all of those things that help support what we're doing so we can keep going. So thank you for listening or watching, and look forward to seeing you in the next one.